Aggregate demand and the law of demand, part of our Week 2 lectures on demand. In this video, we're going to talk about how we get from individual demand to aggregate demand, and then we'll talk about one of the more important findings in all of economics, the law of demand. We talked in our previous video about individuals and the demands that they have. We showed that demands happen at all different prices, but quantity demanded happen at a specific price. Well, if we take everyone's individual demand profile and gather them all together, we can go from individual demands to the aggregate demand, or what we sometimes call the market demand. That would be the demand of all the consumers, and however we're defining the market. Sometimes it'll be a town, sometimes it'll be a country, sometimes it'll be a state or a province, whatever the boundaries are. If we get together all the individual demands, or if we estimate all the individual demands, we'll get to the aggregate demand or the market demand. And we can think about maybe the aggregate demand in the US for Brandeis notebooks. And while we had smaller numbers, in fact, 0 demanded for the individual we were looking at a price of $12, actually the national demand would be for 100 Brandeis notebooks. So we can't just take one consumer and estimate the aggregate demand based on that one consumer. We need to do something a little more complicated to estimate the aggregate demand for a whole nation. And you can imagine this is the aggregate demand for Brandeis notebooks given these quantities. And you can see the same sort of demand schedule that we've had previously for individual demand. Now, one of the things I want to show you is we can represent this demand schedule as a demand function. And that's what we have at the bottom. If we take a price P and plug P into this function down below, then we would get the aggregate quantity demanded. So, for example, if the price is 4, 1,300 minus 100 times the price of 4 is 1,300 minus 400, which is 900, and that matches exactly the demand we have in our demand schedule. So we don't necessarily need a demand schedule to figure out demand. Sometimes we can generalize that and come up with a demand function. This is a kind of a simple demand function. There can be much more complex demand functions, but this will be the format of a lot of the demand functions we use in this class, that it's just a number minus a number times the price. So that's a demand function, and that's again another way we can represent the demand that's here in this demand schedule. Now, once we aggregate to demand, we can say some things. We can say that aggregate quantity demanded for a good will increase if the price drops, but that it's not necessarily true that every individual's quantity demanded will increase. So, for example, if we think about the individual we talked about who had a quantity demanded of 0 at a price of 12, if the market price went from $14 to $12, that individual's quantity demanded actually wouldn't change. It would still be 0. But the aggregate quantity demanded, we assume, would change. So that leads us to an important finding in economics, which is the law of demand. When the price of a good increases, the aggregate quantity demanded decreases. Conversely, when the price of a good decreases, the aggregate quantity demanded increases. Now, there are some rare exceptions to this, what we call Giffen and Veblen goods, and feel free to look those up if you want to know what those are. We talk about a little bit more about those in micro theory, our intermediate micro class. But we're gonna say that almost every good follows the law of demand. If the price goes down, the aggregate quantity demanded will go up. If the price goes up, the aggregate quantity demanded will go down. Now, we can prove this using calculus and with some assumptions. And I will, in a separate video for the Econ 10A class, I will take a look at what we can sort of say about what a proof would look like, just knowing what we know about algebra and demand. We combine all of the individual demands into aggregate or market demand. And the law of demand tells us that if prices go up, aggregate demand will go down and vice versa. Thank you.